being pro-life, is the foundation. And then the other Catholic social teachings are various ways or aspects of promoting human life.
Well, hey everyone, what is up? Welcome or welcome back. My name is Austin. This is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we try to bring simplicity out of theological complexity. Today we're diving into an issue that is not short on complexity, and that is Catholic social teaching. Not that the individual concepts are necessarily difficult, but how do you put these things together, and what is the Catholic vision for engaging with social issues? Now, I know some of you might be terrified already that faith and maybe politics are fusing here. I just encourage you to take a deep breath. This is not a partisan video where we're trying to platform certain things. Rather, I'm trying to bring out of Dr. DeClue, my guest, the underlying foundations of Catholic social teaching and moral theology. How do these things fit together, and where do they come from? I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and I think you will too. But before we get into it, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon subscribers and merch buyers who make this channel possible, especially to my patrons. Look, if you're one of them, thank you so much. But chances are you're actually not watching this because you get to watch my videos without the ads and without these intros, and you see them ahead of time. But if you'd like to be doing that as well, I'd encourage you to go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity to sign up. And doing so, you'll be getting lots of free stuff. You'll be getting early access to videos. You may even be getting a call from me. I'd encourage you to check it out if you're interested in that. Anyway, thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoy this video, and here it is. Well, hey everyone, today I am joined by Dr. Richard DeClue. Dr. Richard DeClue is the Cardinal Henri de Lubac Fellow of Theology at the Word on Fire Institute, holds a Doctorate of Sacred Theology from the Catholic University of America. Thanks so much for being here today, Dr. Richard DeClue, and I am really excited for this.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to be on. Thanks for having me.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. And today we're going to be talking a bit about Catholic social teaching. And I just wanted to give credit to where credit's due. Thanks to Word on Fire for sending this beautiful copy of this Catholic social teaching collection. And something that excited me about this topic is I feel like it's something that a lot of people have maybe heard of, but don't necessarily know a lot about. So I'm excited to dive into that. But first, just if people aren't familiar with you, I'd love to know what drew you to theology.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've always been into the faith since I was a young child. Like, I hear stories about from before my memories start of me being into my faith. So there was never a time for me when my faith was not important to me. But I used to have a lot of conversations with my dad at home about philosophy and theology and things just growing up. Started reading Peter Kraft when I was like in middle school and things like that. But originally I did go to college for the hard sciences. So chemistry, biology, things like that, with an eye towards either pursuing something in medicine or biochemical research and development. And then about halfway through my college career, I switched majors. And I think that the main reason was to oversimplify, I loved the sciences, I enjoyed it, I was excelling in it, but I just found that the questions being pursued were really how questions. How does the universe function? How does this work? How does that? But I was really more interested in the question of why. So the pursuit of meaning. And so for me, I'm really mostly interested in God as the origin and end of humanity. So it was I just was drawn to it as a higher truth. And so I just, like, I could see myself doing both, but I would miss doing theology more if I didn't do it than I would miss the sciences. So switch to theology.
That's really interesting. That's a great way of putting it, that you could do both, but you would miss it more. And I like how you kind of distinguish between the how and the why questions. And interestingly, we actually have some overlap there. Before I got into theology, I was planning on getting into medicine as well, which I'm not sure I've ever talked about on this channel. But there's A fun fact for the audience today. But like I said, we're going to be talking about Catholic social teaching today, which for a lot of people, maybe some people of my audience, are like, yep, I know that, love it. Like, I can tell you what it is, where to find it, all that. And others might be like, I've heard of this, but like, what exactly is it? Or maybe they've heard of the Catholic Church's position on, thing X or Y, but maybe don't understand what undergirds it. And that's what I really want to get at today. But just so that everyone listening to this or watching is on the same page, when I refer to Catholic social teaching, or when I see the cover of this book and I see Catholic social teaching collection, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, in general, it's basically the doctrines of the church that pertain to the dignity of the human person and the just ordering of society in the pursuit of the common good. So it really has to do with the social aspects of our being and how you pursue the common good appropriately. And so it really is, it's kind of a subset of moral theology, really. It has a lot to do with the virtue of justice as well as charity. And so you can kind of just see it that way as a subset of moral theology.
That's interesting. That's a helpful way of putting it. And I imagine when you define it in such a way, it's not necessarily something that's going to have really tight bounds. There might be things like this has to do in some way with the dignity of the person, but it also has to do with something else. And so it's not necessarily like this document gets the red color code of social teaching and this one gets the dogmatic or whatever. It's maybe not quite that clean of a distinction in some ways. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. And, there's always, when you're dealing with like building a just society, which is essentially the main purpose of Catholic social teaching, there's always going to be, you're going to have principles. So it's going to be asserting different principles that you work off of. Then you have to apply those to concrete situations and circumstances. And that's where you can have a lot of sort of prudential disagreement amongst, theologians and whatnot about, in this given case, how do those principles play out? So, which is just kind of a standard issue with moral theology in general sometimes. But
yeah, and I imagine, the Catholic Church being so widespread results in you have these principles, but man, like they're being applied to such diverse contexts, which is part of the joy of theology, is contextualizing and saying, how do we go from here to, these people on the ground, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit going forward. But I want to talk about this one dynamic that Bishop Barron, who does the forward or the introduction to this collection, brings out. And he says Catholic social teaching, when it is not distorted or misrepresented, is famously confounding to the pundits and politicos, both left and right. And when we were on the phone talking about doing this conversation, you mentioned that you've noticed a similar dynamic, that I think you might have said, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but sometimes it equally offends everybody. And why do you think this is?
Well, I think there's a couple of different ways to answer that question. I think one has to do with how we're raised and educated in our country. So typically speaking, our religious formation is segregated from the rest of our education. And very often when we're developing our own political views, for instance, our socioeconomic political views, we're developing them within our American culture as it is. And so fairly early on, we tend to start gravitating towards a political party. And in this country, it's primarily one of two. There's other countries that have like 12, but we have like 2. And so our views start getting formed along those political lines before we even hear about Catholic social teaching. And I think that's part of the problem, is that because now we have a worldview about what the best socioeconomic political policies are, or how to pursue the goods that those relate to. We've already formed our convictions about that. And then now we're trying to come to the Catholic social teaching, and if it challenges our preconceived notions based on our secular formation in those areas, it, it it's jarring because it's actually challenging us to reconceptualize the whole fundamental principles and philosophy behind our views. And because again, to oversimplify in a certain sense, the principles of typical American politics don't really derive from the same source as Catholic social teaching, right? There's some overlap. I'm not saying they're completely incompatible, but it is a different philosophical framework. And so it doesn't fit neatly into one political party or another, and often will come in conflict with each of them in different instances. And so I think that's part of it. Like when I taught Catholic social teaching, I'd get people at different points that would sort of admit their political leanings, and they'd get upset at different points depending on what I was saying at the time. And, you know, I'd always challenge people to, like, okay, what you need to do is really come at this with an open mind. See what the church is trying to say and understand why she's saying it, instead of instantly judging it based on whether or not it fits into your preconceived political allegiances. And I think, unfortunately, people on both the left and the right in this country often put their socioeconomic political views above the teachings of the church. And they try to judge the teachings of the church based on their secular worldviews rather than the other way around. And I think it's somewhat understandable because there's a lot at stake in our political lives. And we spend so much time watching the news and engaging in politics that we've invested so much into being for this party or set of principles that we've adopted in the secular world, that it's difficult for people to be challenged in that without having some sort of visceral reaction, because it's so important to our lives as a public, as a nation, that it, you know, there's a certain fight or flight that comes into play there. And, you know, but I think it's good though, because the truth purifies, and that's why there's the teaching. And I don't think we need to, you know, anytime the Catholic social teaching said something that might challenge or sound challenging to our political allegiances, it's like that's an opportunity for growth and for development and deepening our understanding. So yeah. I think the humility to be open to it is important. And we also have to remember, Catholic social teaching is not American. You know, it's not. It's not based on a particular country. And, you know.
Yeah, there's so much there, and I feel like that answer alone could lead down so many different paths, and I so desire to chase down every one of those rabbit trails, but we'd be here all day. But I mean, that gets into education and catechesis and identity and politics, and there's so much to talk about there. And I imagine that one of the main dangers, as you talk about that idea of we develop or we form our own political opinions on social issues prior to maybe hearing the church's stance on these things, and then so we're trying to maybe fit like a round peg into a square hole, or however that saying goes. And I imagine what maybe is tempting to do there often is to take the social teachings of the church that you agree with and incorporate those, because now your preconceived political ideas have the backing of the church, and then just kind of ignore the ones that you don't like, rather than forming that in the opposite direction. And I'd just be curious, and this is a big question, but what do you see as the way forward? I mean, this seems like a problem of forming the political social views prior to hearing them from the church. Is this an issue of education? Is this like catechesis in the church, in the home? Like, what do you see as the way forward?
I do think a big part of it's catechesis. Which is difficult because, if you're talking about educating children in particular, you're going to, if you try to teach specifics on things that pertain to politics and economics and things like that, you're going to run up against parents, and then you're going to be dealing with, their views. And I think part of the way forward, not to sound too grandiose here, but it's going to come from humility and the pursuit of holiness, which requires docility. And so first and foremost, it has to come from helping people, before you even get into the topic, to calm down and to really have an openness to hear what's being taught and to receiving the wisdom. Because if there's no receptivity, it almost doesn't matter. And you're right, there does tend to be this, because like you were saying, it's not common for like there to be a dogmatic definition of something in the realm of Catholic social teaching. I mean, there are some that would be considered dogmatic, but it's not like a lot of other doctrines in that sense. And so people go, oh, well, that's not infallible, so I can just ignore that. That's just the church's prudential like viewpoint, but I don't have to take it seriously. So they'll ignore it if it challenges their politics, but then they'll hold up the documents when they support them. And so both sides are just doing the same thing. We call it cafeteria Catholicism, right? Where you just kind of pick and choose and leave what you don't like. And I think the path forward is really instilling the discipleship aspect of it. It's like you need to be humble and be formed by this, and trust the Holy Spirit's at work in this teaching, and not just, ignore it whenever it seems uncomfortable or challenging. And that's been extremely beneficial in my own life, because even, I was interested in philosophy and theology since a young child. I was also interested in politics at a very young age. And for me, in studying Catholic social teaching at undergrad and graduate levels, it just sort of was another instance for me where I could see the wisdom of the church increasing my understanding and my knowledge. And to me, it was a beautiful thing. It was like, yes, this makes a lot of sense. And so that helped me sort of subserve my socioeconomic political philosophies to the wisdom of the church. And to me, that's been very fruitful. And so I think it's just getting rid of that fear that somehow we have to just guard ourselves against Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to kind of frame this conversation as well, because I imagine people, anytime they see a video about social issues, which isn't something I've delved into this channel a lot, and so I appreciate the nuance that you bring to this, I think people put their walls up and they get ready to fight. And I think just for people listening, that's a great reminder of maybe even if you're not Catholic, but you just want to learn where the Catholic Church is coming from on this, maybe just take that breath and, allow in a humble posture, say, hey, I have something to learn here. Maybe even just for the sake of understanding where people are coming from, because it'll help you make better sense of why does the Catholic Church do things this way? And for my many Catholic viewers who maybe aren't familiar with this, I think, again, just kind of that humility to see, like, what is the coherence of this? What is the inner logic? And that's kind of where I want to go next, is that question of what is the foundation of Catholic social teaching? Because I've often heard people that say, even if I disagree with this, maybe you sound like Protestants who are into moral theology. I've often heard them say, like, man, what I'm amazed by, though, is the coherence that, okay, even if I don't agree with that doctrine, I see how if you accept X, then this follows from here, and it makes this nice whole picture. So what is it that's gluing together Catholic social teaching?
Well, I love what you just said there, so I'm going to put off with that, and then I'll get specifically into Catholic social teaching. The term Catholic, everyone seems to know that it means universal, but it actually has another meaning as well, that it actually means whole or complete, integral, containing all of the component parts in their mutual relation. So what you just described there is essentially what Catholic means. And so when people are seeing that, oh, wow, this coherence of everything, that is what Catholic means. It means to have all the parts in proper relation. So there's a completeness and integrity aspect of the meaning. It doesn't just mean universal in the sense of throughout the world. That's part of it. But so that's important in every aspect of theology. So usually with whatever course I'm teaching or subject I'm lecturing on, I'll usually actually start with an explanation of how all the different major categories of doctrine relate to each other, and I'll try to show how before I go into the individual one. So if I'm teaching ecclesiology, theology of the church, I'll start by going through what I consider to be the logical order of the relation between all the major categories of teaching, from the Trinity all the way to eschatology, and show how they're all connected as one truth. Now let's talk about the individual truth, the theology of the church, because you can't understand it apart from the whole. And so this notion of integrity is important. When it comes to Catholic social teaching, the most fundamental basis is divine revelation, of course. It's scripture in particular is, the soul of theology, according to Catholic understanding. That's what we call it, the soul of theology. And then coupled with that, of course, is the long tradition of, I'm going to call it a sort of realist metaphysics. So you might say that at the heart of Catholic social teaching, based upon revelation, is a theological anthropology. So it's a theological understanding of the human person. And that involves revelation and reason, of course. That it involves this metaphysical ethics. So it's not, for the Catholic Church, ethics is related to nature, to the reality of being. So, ontology is important here. And so, because everything's based in reality, we're not nominalists, right? So it's this fundamental understanding of human nature as created in the image and likeness of God, destined for sanctity in his heavenly kingdom. And so theological anthropology is the basis for how we delve into specific questions relating to the social order. So I think there's different levels there, right? Divine revelation, specifically, understanding what the human person is, the nature and ends of human nature as created in God's image and destined towards communion with God, which includes the social dimension of human beings. And so it's, I said before that it's a subset of moral theology, which is also kind of a subset of theological anthropology. So, but it's really based on that moral teaching, especially when you're talking about social issues. A big part of that is going to be the twin virtues of justice and charity. So justice being a natural virtue, right, of rendering to others their due, is a huge part of Catholic social teaching. Now, it's not just social justice, because Catholic social teaching will also involve the call for charity, which is a perfection in supernatural. So it's not just a natural beatitude or natural perfection, natural virtue, but supernatural virtue as well. So both of those get brought into Catholic social teaching.
Wow, I think after this, some people are going to want to sign up for some classes where they see how you connect all of these things, because I think that's a great pedagogical method, and I really appreciate how you're showing these things as interconnected. And just as a side note, I think one of the great weaknesses of the academy right now is kind of this siloing of different disciplines, and we have this hyper specialization. So something about this, but nothing about this, and not how they connect. And that isn't actually helpful for pushing things forward. I think for the most part, that's a conversation for another day. But I appreciate your approach there as well with Catholic social teaching of going from revelation and ontology and theological anthropology, and how these things, they all connect, because they should. Our theology should be coherent in this way. And so I think that's really helpful, and that kind of gets a foundational thing of this is where this is coming from. But I want to talk on another level of I think today people both inside and outside the church come to different extremes perhaps of where they want or how they want the church to engage in issues relating to anthropology or social issues in general. And so on the one hand, I think
Yeah.
there's people that just want to say, like, can the church stay out of politics and people's bedrooms and all of these things? Like, let the church do the religious thing, and we'll define that nice and narrow and stay over there, and we'll do our thing. Thank you very much. And then on the other side, I think you have people saying, hey, like, the fundamental nature of the church is to solve social issues. And so why isn't the church doing X, Y, or Z? Like, it needs to be engaged in every single thing. And yeah, like the religion stuff, what like that's fine, but like the real issue is what's happening on the ground. And I get it. I understand how different experiences can lead people to those places, and maybe they've been hurt by the church engaging poorly or not engaging. And I totally understand how either of those opinions could come about. But what would you say is the Catholic vision and rationale for engaging in these issues?
Yeah, it's a very important question. If I have heard people um, make the same claim, like, well, can it just stay out of it? And my direct answer is no. And the reason it can't stay out of it is that because a just social order is part of the perfection of the human person on their way towards their final end. And so anything that pertains to the purification, the installation or infusion of virtue and guidance on right reasoning and right practice is the purview of the church. There is no, you can't, I'm trying to prevent myself from going off on too many tangents, but this is, I have another interview later this week on Cardinal Henri de Lubac, and particularly on his nature and grace question, because that was a huge thing that in the mid 20th century that's still going on as a debate. But it's interesting because part of the reason for his teaching on nature and grace was precisely his worry that the society was becoming too secular, that this a radical separation between the natural and the supernatural is, for him, it's not true. There is a distinction between nature and grace that's important that he affirms, but in the concrete world in which we live, man was created by the triune God and is called towards holiness in union with the triune God. That's the truth of man. And so you can't, even your political views cannot be separated from your religious views. God is the source of all, and he's the end of all. And we live out that holiness and those virtues in the concrete, and very often through our social interactions. And so pursuing the truth about the good, especially the common good, is precisely what the church is meant to do. It's part of her prophetic office to speak to power. And it's true in the Old Testament as well, right? And the prophets were often sent to the kings, right? To the nations, and so it's the job of the church precisely to help guide Catholics in the pursuit of the virtues, which includes the virtues involved in the social order. And so she can't stay out of it. She would be shirking her responsibility. So that's sort of a long-winded answer for why the church has to do this.
I think that's helpful, and I think I love how you tied that into Henri de Lubac and nature and grace, and I'll have to find whatever podcast you're going to be on and listen to that, because it sounds like a very interesting conversation. And I like the way you put it, that the church would be shirking her responsibilities to not engage in these things. And again, it goes back to this idea of kind of this coherence and this, even individually, I think when we have our religious views and then our political views and our social views, and they don't have any inner logic, that that's going to create tension. And I think this, of course, the same is true at a larger level for the church. If the church is supposed to have the church's views on what humans are, has to have something to say of how humans should be treated. It's just kind of interdependent in that way, or interconnected at least. So I appreciate that. So we've kind of laid out, the undergirding logic, and then why engage in these things. Now I want to talk about some of the themes that are drawn out. And so on the USCCB, which is the United States, what is that, Council of Catholic Bishops, something like that?
United States Conference of Catholic Bishops.
There we go. Acronyms, they're hard. On their website, they lay out 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. And I'd like to dive into a few of them here. The first theme, and we've kind of talked about this, it was one of the first things I think you said, was the life and dignity of the human person. And this ties in, at least I think, into one of the church's most well-known social teachings, and that is being pro-life. I think if you ask people, what is Catholic social teaching, I think you'd be hard-pressed to get someone not to start talking about the pro-life, pro-choice issues, even though maybe that's not a helpful way of framing that, but that's neither here nor there. So why is this something the church is so passionate about, the dignity of the human life, and then how that plays out? Hey, we'll be right back to the interview, but first I want to tell you about another sponsor for today, and that is Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is a group of Christian counselors that exist to help you get the help you need. One of the first YouTube videos I ever made was called "You Can Have Jesus and a Therapist Too." And what I wanted to do in that video was draw out the fact that so many people are struggling with mental health. And the last thing we want to do is make it more difficult for people to reach out to get the help they need by creating this stigma around it. It's something that I'm really passionate about and think we need to end in Christian circles. And that's why I'm so excited to be partnering with Faithful Counseling. Their counselors all will be counseling from a Christian perspective, and you can connect with them from any country in the world. They have counselors that speak many different languages. And hey, if it's important to you to have a counselor from your specific tradition or background, they can do their part to try to pair you up with one of them as well. All of their counselors are licensed with over 3,000 hours of experience. You can connect with these counselors in a variety of ways. In fact, you can do video sessions, phone calls, live chat, or messaging. All of the messaging is secure, and if it's between scheduled sessions, you'll receive a response within 24 to 48 hours. If this is interesting to you, if you think this would be helpful for you or maybe a loved one, I'd encourage you to go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity. If you do that, first of all, you'll get 10% off your order, and you will be matched with a counselor in less than 24 hours. Again, that's faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity to be matched with a counselor in less than 24 hours and get 10% off your first month. Faithful Counseling costs $260 per month, which gets you unlimited messaging with your counselor in 4 30-minute sessions. But again, if you go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity, you'll get 10% off that first month. Lastly, Faithful Counseling is not a crisis line. If you are currently experiencing suicidal thoughts or ideation, please reach out to a crisis line or hotline. You can find one of them at www.crisistextline.org. Please do so. You can reach out. You do not have to do this alone. Well, thank you all so much, and I will let you get back to the video. But if you want to check them out, again, faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity. The link is in my bio and in the pinned comment. Well, back to the interview.
Because it really is as I was saying before, is the foundation of all social relations. If the individual person does not have a fundamental dignity that must be respected and has a right to be respected, and therefore we have an obligation to respect the individual human person, then everything else is just a farce. So if you don't have that high view of the sanctity of human life, and understanding the fact that God is the Lord of life, we don't have the authority to just take away life at our whim. That's not with it. So it's really a statement about what we don't have the right to do, and therefore the limits of our power in what's allowable. And then again, if you don't have the right to life, then you don't have any rights, fundamentally. Because if you can just take away the life, then you're taking away all rights. And so it's the fundamental basis of all social teaching in some ways.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. The idea of if you don't have the right to life, what rights do you have? I think I've heard a lot of frustration recently, and there's been legislation passed in Texas recently on abortion, which has sparked all kinds of conversations. And a retort that's often given to the church, which I think we'd maybe be remiss not to touch on here as we talk about the dignity of life, is that, okay, you're pro-life for unborn babies, but why aren't you pro-life for people at all phases of life? And I imagine, something caught my throat there. I imagine that the Catholic reaction would be, well, yes, like we want to be pro-life at every stage. I mean, is that what's getting at? And I know sometimes that's being pushed into different conversations, but this fundamental value of human dignity and the value of human life, it does have more it has to do with more than just abortion, correct? I mean, this is the foundation.
Yes, and my retort to someone saying that would be simply, I don't accept your rhetorical question as true. It's not true that the church isn't pro-life in every aspect of, post-birth. That's her social teaching is exactly an example of how she is pro-life at all the stages. And that's why it's a standard Catholic, principle to say from, conception to natural death, because it is at every stage of human life. And that's why, you look at the church's social teachings in general, and it's precisely what it is. It's talking about the dignity of life, and they're different aspects in some sense. So the dignity of the human person and right to life, being pro-life, is the foundation, and then the other Catholic social teachings are various ways or aspects of promoting human life. So they all do tie together.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And I want to jump into one that I think might be surprising, because I don't think for anyone listening to this, the fact that the Catholic Church is pro-life is going to come as a surprise. And I think for Catholics, that means like, okay, that's job well done. That you're letting people know what you stand for there. But here's an outgrowth of that idea of the dignity in human life that when I came across it as one of the 7 themes, I have to say I was a bit surprised. I had heard of it, but it's not something I hear necessarily shouted from the rooftops, and maybe we can talk about why that might be if you have ideas. But that is that one of the 7 things was the dignity of work and the right of workers. Can you explain a bit, like, what does this mean, and why would this count as one of the 7 themes?
Yeah, and it actually ties in directly to your last question too, because I forget which scripture passage it is, but it alludes to the fact that to deny a laborer his wages is equated with murder. So it's considered an assault on human life. First, let's talk about the dignity of work. So even before the fall, man was put in the garden to cultivate it. So there's a certain sense in which, because we're created in the image and likeness of God, which is especially true because of our intellect and our wills, right? The ability to know and our ability to choose to act as agents, as responsible agents, that God has given us an ability to sort of be cooperators in creation. Now, we can't bring something into being out of nothing the way that God can, obviously. So it's a very limited participation in God's creative activity, but nonetheless, it is there. We often call artistic expression creative, right? It's a creativity. That's part of the reflection of the beauty of human nature, to be able to take what's there and mold it and help bring it to perfection. And so it's actually a way in which man shows that he is the image of God, is by engaging with created reality and making it flourish and bear fruit. And so there's a certain sense in which man is meant to be active. He's not meant to just be a passive recipient. He's meant to be actively engaged in doing things that are good for him, his family, society. So that's what we mean by work. It's a way of using the talents God has given you to produce more fruit, and therefore becoming a secondary agent of God himself, where he's allowing you the grace to participate in his goodness by your creativity and your bearing fruit in your act, in what you do. And so it's not, work isn't just a punishment. Yes, there's the whole sweat of the brow thing from after the fall. It's become harder. We don't like work, all that sort of thing. But it's fundamentally, work is dignified. It's part of good human flourishing to work and to work well. Now, because that's the case, there's also a right to work, right? So that's one of the principles. And therefore, there are rights of worker. So that protects the dignity of the work that man does. So the rights involved for the worker are part of the way that you protect the dignity of the work. And which is, of course, based in the dignity of the worker himself as a person, and must be treated as a whole person. He's not just a means to an end, but a man is an end in himself. And so you always have to treat people with that sort of dignity. And so that's where the rights of the workers come in. It's what is sort of owed to someone as a worker, precisely based on their human dignity and the dignity of work that they're doing. And so there's principles involved in the fact that as an employer, you already owe them something based on their dignity and the dignity of the work that they do before they even start working for you. So you have responsibilities if you're going to employ people to make sure that those rights and their dignity are not affronted. You can't just use them for your own ends and leave them on the side of the road. Like, if you're going to employ people, you have to employ them in a way that respects their dignity.
Yeah, that's helpful. And it's interesting to see, again, kind of, not only is the life and dignity of the human person a theme, but it's almost kind of an organizing theme to these things, that everything's going to flow from there. And now I think this next thing I want to hit on, maybe people would struggle to connect a bit more. And I'll admit, I do think it was last on the list, not to put too much stock in that. But that is the care for creation. And that's another thing that people might not immediately equate with the Catholic Church, though it's something that Pope Francis has been, at least in my limited understanding, much more vocal about than perhaps past pontificates have been. That it's been a central theme for him. And I'd just be curious, like, how does this relate to Catholic social teaching? I think it might surprise some people in some ways.
Yeah, so, and it has been, it's not new with Francis. I mean, the concern for the environment was spoken of by Pope Benedict XVI and Pope St. John Paul II. But they also dealt with other things more. So he may be dealing with it more, but it's already present in prior magisterial documents on these questions. It relates, again, this is where I think that the theology is so important, because it's based, again, on theological anthropology. And part of what God created man to do was have dominion, right? But that dominion is really a stewardship, because it's a recognition of that what God created is good. And part of our reflection as humans made in the image of God is the care for his creation. What he has entrusted to us and given us dominion over is a sort of stewardship. And so we've been given that task to exercise this sort of dominion. And it's also out of respect for the Creator, and seeing that what he has created is good, and therefore we need to protect it. And now there's all sorts of balancing principles involved in the concrete, but the reason, it's actually sort of the same reason that Catholicism has always supported the sciences as well. It's because the natural world comes from God, it has a certain dignity and value inherent in it that needs to be respected, and that includes our environment. Now, when it comes to Catholic social teaching on the environment, that's one aspect of it. So it's just the inherent dignity of the natural created world, and therefore the need to respect it and ensure that it doesn't get destroyed through our, through our activities, but continues to flourish. It's also a matter of social justice insofar as, because it was created for all, including other people and including future generations. And so it's also considered, it's sort of like, okay, we've been given this treasure, we can't squander it so that our children are left with nothing. And, sort of, if we abuse the natural world and the created world during our lifetime and thus end up leaving it in disarray for future generations, we've sort of stolen from them, so to speak. We're committing acts of injustice against the human race moving forward. So that's where the justice aspect comes into play as well. We can't just do whatever we want for our own self-gain at the expense of what is the rightful inheritance of all.
Yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic to it there, which again kind of ties these things in about not only do we care for the environment because of who we are and kind of that creation mandate we're given of having dominion over the earth, which I love as you described as kind of a stewardship. I think that's a good word to use there. But also our relationship to other people, that this is an earth that we share with others, and not just those alive today, but those that come after us. And we have a certain responsibility to treat it with dignity so that we're not stealing from them in that way. You mentioned in your answer there, and it's something I kind of want to just dive into a bit as a clarifying thing for these things. You said, and there's all types of balances on this. And I imagine, social issues are complex, right? So how do you dignify work and care for the environment when maybe sometimes it seems like the work that someone's doing might be harming the environment? Or I've heard people often talk about the issue of how can Catholics be, for the environment if they're also opposed to birth control and we have too many people and that's harming the environment. It seems like not only is it like a balancing act, I guess, but kind of there's a prioritization. Like and I know this is, complicated, but when we find things that it's like, man, there's a tension issue here. What is the job of Catholic theologians or just Catholics in their everyday life to try to resolve those tensions?
Yeah, it is important, and I'm going to kind of back up and discuss an important aspect of moral theology in general that might help illuminate this question. And that's the fact that without getting into a golden mean fallacy, it is just the fact that a virtue stands in the middle between two vices, right? So you can either fail to have a virtue by excess or privation. So an example often given is fortitude or courage. You can fail to be courageous and fail to have fortitude by refusing, because of cowardice, which is the vice, refusing to face a danger that you ought to face, right? So like if I fail to try to protect my child because I'm afraid of the threat and I kind of just shirk my responsibility of protecting, well, then that's cowardice. I'm not being courageous. You can also have rashness or the opposite virtue, which is sort of seeking danger because you get a thrill out of it. Well, that's not fortitude or courage either. That's unnecessarily creating or putting yourself in places of harm and danger for the sake of combating danger. And so you're failing in the virtue there. So yes, all these there's a lot of complexity to all these different questions, which is one thing that I think often gets misunderstood. So, not to name any names, but I kind of got on made a comment on Twitter the other day because I was trying to correct a misunderstanding. There was a statement made, for instance, that the Catholic Church stands firmly on the side of unions. And I was like, well, it stands firmly on the right to form unions. And this is where I think people get things, they oversimplify things too much. Like, oh, unions good, right? Capital bad, workers good, employers bad. And the church is like, no, you have a right to form a union to protect your dignity and your rights as workers. That doesn't mean everything a union does is good and therefore sanctioned by the church. The dignity of the worker does not mean that there's a lack of dignity of the employer. It does, capital and labor, we reject the Marxist duality of there's an inherent intrinsic necessary struggle between capital and labor. No, we believe both are necessary, both are called to virtue, and both are capable of being unjust. A worker's capable of robbing his employer, right? So it's not, part of the issue we have in American politics is we tend to absolutize one side of the equation at the expense of another. It reminds me of a definition of heresy once that I heard was it's the absolutization of one truth at the expense of others. And so that often happens when in questions of social justice and Catholic social teaching is people emphasize one thing to the detriment of the other. And it's like, no, there's a dialectical balance. And so, for instance, when you talk about the dignity of work, which involves using creation in ways that help it bear fruit for the good of our sisters, which means we are going to be doing things to the environment, right? We're going to be somehow affecting it and changing it. The balance is not, the way that we could fail to have that virtue is either by, refusing to engage in it at all because we need to just, let the natural world flourish without any sort of activity in it at all, or I'm going to get as much out of this piece of land as I possibly can and leave it in complete ruins. Well, so the virtue lies in the middle. It's using the goods of the earth, but in a way that allows it to sustain its goodness and it can continue to bear the fruit that it can bear. So it's not, you have the right use and then you have misuse. And so the virtue lies in using but not misusing. And again, there's also that balance between, okay, we can't absolutize this equation. We can't, for instance, there is a certain ordering of principles, right? So there's a certain extent to which by engaging in work and providing for the needs of people, there is going to be some impact on the environment that might be unavoidable, at least at this time, or to some extent. If it in general is good for humans, humans do have a certain priority, right? The goods of the earth in some sense are meant for man, right? So you don't put the environment above people, right? So, there's different hierarchies of being here too. So yeah, I know that's kind of a long-winded answer, but basically, yeah, there's a balancing act there where it's finding out where the proper use is and avoiding the misuse that respects the goodness of creation and the goods for people. So, and how those balance, because the misuse typically would be exemplified by destroying the natural goodness, right? And robbing that goods then from other people. And so they're related again. So I know it's kind of a long-winded answer, but it's part of Catholic social teaching precisely is trying to illuminate the principles on all sides of the equation.
Yeah. And then go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So the role of like people who specialize in Catholic social teaching, which I don't, it's not my specialty, is precisely to help people understand the complexities and how to balance those out in the concrete, so that we can make good decisions, good policy decisions, good economic decisions, good virtuous business decisions, and so forth.
Yeah, and no need to apologize for what you characterized as a long-winded response, because I think that's precisely what we need is nuance in these issues, because so often our opinion on social issues are formed in whatever fits in a tweet. Is it 280 characters now, 140, whatever it is?
I don't even know. Yeah.
But we get our politics, even often I think we're getting our theology, and if not tweets, then sound bites. And that's kind of how we're engaging in the world. And it's no wonder that we see polarization and just a lack of nuance. So I appreciate you bringing that nuance to the table here. I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it'll give people a launching pad to understand these issues better. That's one of my favorite things that's come out of this, is kind of seeing how these things are connected, so that when they go maybe engage with a book like the one put out by Word on Fire that has a lot of these magisterial documents on these things, they can understand how these things are connected and they can engage more. What I want to do now, though, is it's actually a new segment on the show. So you're going to be the first guest that gets to do this. And I've really enjoyed this in some podcasts that I listen to. This idea is not original with me, but I want to end on what I'm going to call the final four. So just four kind of quick answer questions here that I think will just help us focus on what matters most, which I always want to be getting guests back to in these videos. So the first thing I want to ask today is, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
I'm going to give a kind of a twofold answer. One is the sacramental doubleheader, which is what I call it. Going to confession immediately followed by Mass. And then Eucharistic adoration.
Yeah, I like that. The sacramental doubleheader. That's good. All right. Question number 2. Outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
Yeah, that's a really, I was trying to think of a good answer to that question, because there's so many good books. I want to say, if I have to pick one, I'm going to say probably Ratzinger's Principles of Catholic Theology.
Interesting.
Because it brings together so many different themes of his, and to some extent it's also derivative of the work of Henri de Lubac. So the parts that affect me the most. So it's, because his work on Eucharistic ecclesiology, I think, is de Lubac's work that influenced Ratzinger, has been for me, the most enlightening theologically in my life.
That's really interesting.
So behind a lot of that would be de Lubac's book Catholicism. But since I actually encountered the main themes of that through Ratzinger, that's why I picked Ratzinger. So he was the one that kind of, how I got the impact.
I like it. You're able to kind of get, I think the PETA approved version of the saying is, you're able to feed two birds with one scone there. So there you have it. All right. Question number 3, you're having coffee with your undergrad or early grad school self. You've been through a lot of schooling. What would be one piece of advice you'd give him for his future in theology?
I would probably reiterate something I already knew back then, but has become increasingly important to me. And it's really a piece of advice given, I believe, by St. Francis of Assisi to St. Anthony of Padua. When he was asked to go for further studies to help teach fellow Franciscans, he asked Francis if he could do that. And Francis said, yes, as long as you don't allow the flame of piety to be squashed or quelched, or I forget the verbiage there, but prayer has to be the basis of your theology. If you're not in intimate communion with God, through the grace of Jesus Christ, then you're blind. Mm-hmm. And you you shouldn't be saying things, basically, if you're not open to the truth through the gift of God's grace that enlightens our minds and purifies our hearts and our wills, then you can't trust what you're saying.
Wow.
So you have to have a solid prayer life as the basis of your theology.
I love that. That's a great answer. I appreciate that. Last question, and this might be the one I'm most excited for to add into the end of my videos. It's because this channel is called Gospel Simplicity, and it's been pointed out a number of times that what I get into here is quite complex, and people have told me I should change the name, which is not happening, to Gospel Complexity. But in one sentence, if you could, which I know is super difficult, but what is the gospel?
The good news that despite our frequent and constant rejections of God's love that has tarnished our image, we have been given access through Christ to be created anew and to live in eternal, perfect communion with Him in heaven.
That's good. I like that. Dr. DeClue, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate your time. I know I don't take it lightly, and I appreciate the time of everyone that's going to watch this sometime in the future, especially if you're still here with us 57 minutes in. Really appreciate that so much. I'll close as I always do by saying until next time, be on the lookout for more videos, but way, way more important than that is to go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world.